Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 11. Barzog. To the east of the Dragon's Spine, where stone peaks stabbed into the low, leaden sky like shards of black glass, lay the northern steppes. This was a kingdom of cold, where the very earth seemed frozen in an eternal, silent vigil. The air hung here like a thick, heavy curtain, reeking of the soot from distant, unquenchable fires and the bitter, piercing tang of wormwood. Beneath a traveler's feet, the frozen soul crunched under a sun that was dull and offered no warmth. Every step in the desolate, oppressive silence echoed with a hollow, muffled thud, a sound like a blow on a coffin lid. And this sinister accompaniment dogged all who dared to cross these lands. A wind, sharp and piercing, roamed the endless expanses, combing through the dried stalks of grass and sometimes bringing with it echoes of distant, incomprehensible sounds, perhaps the lonely, mournful howl of a beast, or the weeping of a lost soul forever bound to this harsh emptiness. And it was in these merciless lands, where survival itself was a daily feat, that the orc tribes roamed. Their life was as simple and cruel as the reflection of the steppe that bore them. It flowed by ancient, immutable laws of strength, laws passed down through generations in hoarse, cracked sagas told around smoky, smoldering fires on long winter nights. They built no cities, raised no fortress walls. Their homes were crude, shaggy tents, stitched from wolf pelts and stretched on crooked, time-blackened poles. Their sanctuaries were but piles of stones, silent barrows raised where the blood of fallen chieftains had once been spilled, soaked into the earth and become part of its memory. The children of these steppes were born in battle and died with weapons in their hands. Their first cry mingled with the clang of steel, and their last breath with the death rattle of a vanquished foe. The skin of the orcs, covered in a network of scars, scabs, and old abrasions, resembled clay cracked by the sun and desiccated by the winds. Each scar was a chronicle of a single skirmish, each lost eye a silent testament to the ruthlessness of their world. They moved across the steppe with a slow, deliberate confidence, like a pack of hungry predators stalking prey. Their narrow, yellow eyes constantly scanned the horizon, searching for the slightest movement, shadow, or glint. When they spoke, their voices were coarse and abrupt, like stone grating on stone, devoid of any softness or melody. Even their laughter was sharp and joyless, akin to the bark of a sick, embittered dog. At the head of each such tribe stood a chieftain. The chieftain was the strongest of the strong, having proven his right to rule in countless skirmishes and duels. His word was law, his command fate, brooking no argument. Beside him, in the shadow of his might, there always lurked a shaman, a gaunt, stooped elder, clad in robes of dried hide and yellowed feathers. The shaman was the voice of the ancestral spirits, a counselor and keeper of ancient, dark rituals. He could bless a warrior for battle, imbuing him with fury, or lay upon him a withering curse. Between these two figures existed a fragile, constantly shifting boundary of power, one founded on the brute force of muscle and the keenness of steel, the other on secret knowledge and a deep, animal fear of the unseen world. One such tribe was the Ash-Skin clan, encamped in one of the deep stone basins hidden from prying eyes by jagged, wine-scoured cliffs whose peaks resembled blackened, rotten teeth. The air here was thick, almost viscous with the acrid smoke from fires kindled with dry tumbleweed and dung, and the heavy, bestial smell emanating from the warg pens. These giant wolf-like creatures, their shaggy, angular shadows flitting constantly at the camp's edge, lent their low, guttural growls to the orcs' hoarse voices, creating a continuous, menacing hum. Tents of roughly cured wolf pelts, stretched on crooked poles, formed a rough, untidy circle, at the center of which, like a black, pulsating heart, smoldered the largest fire. Here, upon a heap of calloused hides that gave off a heavy, sweetish rancid odor of old blood, sweat, and smoke, sat a chieftain named BARZOG the Black Spear. He was the living embodiment of the law of strength that ruled his kin, larger than the others, broader in the mighty shoulders, his body covered in white, pitted scars like cracks in sun-dried clay. His armor of thick, hardened leather was pitted with nicks, scratches, and dull, rusty rivets. His face, with its low, sloping brow and massive, protruding tusks, was carved by deep wrinkles like the channels of dried-up rivers, and each such wrinkle was packed with eternal, unwashable steppe dust. His eyes, small and burning with a predatory yellow fire, gazed upon the world with a silent, simmering rage and an absolute, unquestioning confidence in his right to rule. Every tense muscle in his face, every gesture of his powerful arm spoke of a readiness to affirm that right at any moment. With cold steel and fierce, unstoppable force. Beside him, in the shadow cast by his massive frame, sat the shaman, his fingers, long and gnarled like the roots of an old, dead tree, constantly, almost unconsciously, fumbled with amulets carved from yellow bone and beast teeth. Each dawn, the camp of the Ash-Skin clan awoke, and this awakening was like that of a wounded but dangerous beast, slow, reluctant, with a low grumbling and a hidden threat in every movement. The warriors, stretching and scratching their hardened skin, would first tend to their weapons. They checked the blades of notched axes and heavy cleavers, running their fingers along the edge, appraising each nick. Then came the dry, sharp scrape, the sound of steel sliding on coarse whetstone. This sound, abrupt and insistent, sliced through the morning silence like a knife cutting high. Those sent by the chieftain or shaman on distant scouting or hunting patrols departed in silence, dissolving into the gray pre-dawn haze, their figures merging with the endless, monotonous landscape. The younger orcs, whose bodies were not yet marred by scars and whose eyes burned not with rage but with impatient excitement, remained in camp. They gathered in training grounds, cordoned off from the rest of the camp by stakes driven into the earth, and under the watchful eyes of old, experienced warriors, they learned the craft of killing. Night fell upon the steppe swiftly, plunging the world into a darkness so thick and almost tangible it seemed one could touch it. The returning warriors gathered around the fires. They ate in silence, tearing at tough, undercooked meat with their teeth, and their faces in the flickering firelight seemed carved from old, cracked wood. Only rarely did a hoarse, abrupt shout shatter the silence, not a cry of mirth or fellowship, but a short, animalistic outburst of the rage that simmered and seethed inside. Finding no other outlet, wrapped in coarse hides reeking of smoke and animal hair, they lay down around the dying fires. Their breathing, heavy and uneven, merged with the endless rustle of the wind roaming the basin into a strange, anxious, primeval music, full of unspoken longing and hidden, ready to erupt violence. Thus, day after day, their life flowed an eternal, inexorable cycle of struggle, governed by the unyielding will of the Black Spear and the mysterious, frightening rituals of the shaman. They were ready at any moment to fall upon any outsider who dared violate the borders of their land. Like a sudden and merciless storm breaking from the low, leaden sky. On one such day, when the cold sun hung at its zenith, casting short, ugly shadows from the tents that resembled flattened creatures, an orc who had just returned from a distant hunt approached BARZOG the Black Spear. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of sweat and the smoke of smoldering bones that hung over the camp in a motionless cloud. The hunter was covered in dust, his rough, cracked earth skin gleaming with an oily sheen in the pale sun, and in his sunken, fever-bright eyes burned the anxious fire of a wild beast cornered. "Chieftain," the hunter's voice broke, hoarse and rasping. Every exhalation left his chest in a thick puff of vapor, as if his own body held a hidden, smoldering fire, a mix of fear and feverish excitement. A day's journey toward the rising sun. BARZOG slowly turned his massive head. Yellow eyes, like dulled lumps of brimstone, narrowed to slits. He wasn't just looking, he was drinking in every detail, every hint of truth or deception on the dust-caked face of the orc, reading the tension in every swollen tendon on his neck, the tremor in the hands clutching his own thighs. He uttered not a word. He merely raised a hand, a movement honed by years of absolute authority, a gesture brooking no delay, no argument, commanding him to continue. His own palm, resting on his knee, was a map of past battles, a network of white, sunken scars. Each was a story, a fight, a life taken, or a wound that had nearly claimed his own. And now this palm lay motionless, yet ready in an instant to clench into a stone fist, to give an order that would be followed only by blood. "Strangers," the hunter exhaled, and the word hung in the stifling air, ominous and final, like a sentence carved on the tablets of fate itself. "Orcs, but their blood is foreign, and the smoke of their fire smells of other dust. They've pitched their tents right at the foot of the stone pillars, the very ones called the fingers of the dead god. They are many, chieftain, not a handful of lost curs, but a whole tribe, crawled here like a storm cloud from the east. I saw it with my own eyes. Their sentries ride wargs, fat and mean, prowling the rocks as if they already count these lands their own." The air around them shifted suddenly, becoming thick and viscous, like swamp mire swallowing sound. The warriors who a moment before had been sharpening weapons nearby went still. The sharp, dry scrape of steel on stone was cut off mid-stroke, as if its own throat had been slit. Their hands, calloused and strong, clenched the hafts of their axes with the habitual, unconscious force, feeling the familiar, reassuring roughness of the hide tightly wrapped around the shaft. Even the shaman, immersed in his quiet ritual by a fire where the bitter spirit of smoldering herbs twisted upward, ceased his muttering. He slowly turned his face toward the chieftain, wrinkled, desiccated, resembling a baked pear. In his murky, deeply sunken eyes, holding the vague wisdom of generations, there was no question, only a focused, heavy understanding. A thin tendril of smoke from the smoldering roots twisted in the suddenly stilled air, and its ancient, bitter smell now seemed the very scent of foreboding, a harbinger of storm. With a heavy, grating sound, like a stone slab shifting from its age-old bed, BARZOG rose from the heap of hides, every muscle in his mighty body tensed, standing out under the skin in hard, knotted relief, like a bowstring drawn taut before release. His shadow, grotesquely elongated by the low sun, crawled across the suddenly hushed camp, covering the warriors in a single patch of coming calamity. In that moment, there was something of an ancient boulder breaking loose from a slope about him, inexorable and crushing. The pressure emanating from his silent figure was palpable, like a change in the air before an elemental strike, when silence becomes thick and ringing. "How many?" he growled. Just one word, short and blunt as an axe haft. But in that word lay the full weight of the coming decision, a weight that now settled on the shoulders of every soul in the camp. From the grizzled veteran to the youth yet to taste battle, the hunter did not raise his eyes. His gaze was fixed on the ground before his knees, at the dark, damp spots his sweat left in the dust. Not less than our clan, chieftain, perhaps more. And their wargs. He paused, searching for the terrible simplicity of the word, are well fed. The silence that followed these words was of a different kind. It hung in the air, like a heavy, smothering blanket, dense and almost tangible. It was broken only by the crackling of logs in the fire and a deep, discontented growl from the pens, where the hungry warg sensed trouble. BARZOG slowly swept his gaze over the frozen warriors around him. He looked into their eyes, narrow, yellow slits burning in the shadow of overhanging brows like coals beneath ash. He saw no fear there, no wretched, soul-eating tremor. He saw expectation, a mute, predatory, patient expectation that had built in their bones through long winters at smoky fires. A hunger for action, simple and unyielding as a battering ram against oak gates. A hunger now frozen in every muscle, every clenched fist. The ancient enmity between tribes, old as these hills and harder than their stone, was older than any tale told in hoarse voices by night, older than songs of dead heroes and gods long turned away from this world's cruelty. It lived in the blood, seeped into the bones, sounded in the first cry of a newborn orc child before it understood the meaning of words. And now that ancient strife, slumbering in the depths of memory, was awakening, rising from the dark core of instinct like a hungry beast disturbed in its lair by a foreign scent. It was waking, and in its waking could already be heard the future clash of steel on steel, the rattle of the dying, and the heavy, sweetish smell of blood mixed with dust. "All who can hold iron," BARZOG commanded. His voice did not thunder, but it carried that same relentless, blunt resolve that had guided his line through generations, through the ashes of burned encampments and fields of old slaughter strewn with whitened bones. "Who can raise an axe and drive a spear? We move at first light. Let the strangers learn through their bitter fear whose land this is, whose bones have fertilized it, whose spirits walk it." The shaman nodded approvingly, his long, crooked fingers, like tangled roots, clenched an amulet of polished bone and worn-down feathers, carved long ago from the thigh bone of a mountain eagle. His toothless lips moved, whispering an ancient, guttural incantation, not a plea, but a summons, hammering fury into hearts as a hammer drives a nail into wood. The hunter, finally raising his head, bared his teeth in silent anticipation, exposing yellow fangs sharp as obsidian shards. His gaze now held not a trace of its former anxiety, only the pure, primeval joy of coming slaughter, the simple joy a wolf knows when it scents a herd, the eternal circle, the struggle for the land beneath their feet, for water in the drying riverbeds, for the right to breathe. This harsh, prickly tasting air was making another turn, a creaking and inevitably bloody one, and the Ash-Skin clan was ready for it, as it had always been ready, for in this endless rotation lay their only, immutable truth, their fate, and their sole justification before the face of the indifferent steppe. The next morning, when the first rays of the sun, thin and red as blood seeping from a shallow wound, began to spread across the bleak sky, the shaman approached BARZOG. The air was cold and motionless, frozen by the night's breath, and every sound in this pre-dawn hush, the creak of taut leather armor, the dull clank of iron, the heavy, snorting breath of not yet fully awake wargs echo, with an unnatural, ringing clarity, as if the world was holding its breath before a leap. The elder walked, leaning on his staff of twisted, dark root, polished to a sheen by time and the touch of palms. His eyes, deep set in sockets dark as caves, burned with that peculiar inner fire kindled during long nights of solitary communion with the unseen, a fire that saw what was hidden from the sight of simple mortals burdened with flesh and momentary cares. He walked slowly but with an unexpected firmness for his frail body, and the warriors making final preparations for the march involuntarily parted before him, feeling an inexplicable, cold shiver along their spines, a superstitious dread before this living thread, connecting their crude world with the invisible, hint-laden one. "Chieftain," he spoke, his voice, hoarse and broken like the creak of old dry wood in a stubborn wind, cut through the morning stillness, disrupting the habitual, almost ritual order of final preparations. "Last night, the spirits of the steppe spoke to me." Not whispered spoke BARZOG, whose mighty, scarred hands were checking the blade of his two-handed axe with habitual, mechanical precision, coated with a thin film of protective grease, slowly raised his head, his yellow eyes, narrow and piercing as slits in armor, narrowed further as he studied the shaman's face with that same silent, full attention gaze he reserved for only the most crucial things, the choice of attack angle, a weak point in an enemy's defense, the breath of death in a foe's eyes. He uttered no word, asked no question, but his silence was more eloquent than any shout. His entire being, from the crown of his head covered in tangled, greasy hair to his wide-set, firmly planted feet, expressed a concentrated, heavy anticipation. Even the air around them both seemed frozen, held breath, as if nature itself had paused to await a tidings that could tip the scales of fate. In the coming battle, over the steppes, the shaman continued, and his thin, almost translucent fingers clenched the amulet hanging on his chest, made of yellowed, old tooth bone and time-thin feathers. A fire flew, a celestial fire, and it fell far to the south, beyond the edge of the visible world. He paused, and his cloudy gaze fixed on some distant point, as if seeing that fall once more. I saw its light, blinding and pitiless, cut through the night's darkness, leaving behind a tail of sparks that died out one by one, like the last sighs of the dying. It burned with a cold flame such as no fire of tumbleweed or dung gives, and from it came a low hum that filled my whole being, not with fear, but with ancient terror and awe, as if the earth itself had seen something it was not meant to see. He paused again, letting the chieftain feel the full weight and strangeness of his words. Around them, the camp was finally stirring to life, the clatter of gathered weapons, hoarse, abrupt calls reached them, but here, by the chieftain, time seemed frozen, a quiet island in a churning sea of preparation. Only the soft crackle of the dying night fire was heard, and the distant, agitated growling of wargs in the pen where they paced, sensing something otherworldly and ominous in the stifled air. "The spirits say this is a sign," the shaman exhaled, and his breath, worn and most, mingled with the vapor coiling in the icy air, creating for a moment a ghostly, trembling wreath around his toothless, sunken mouth, a sign of power, fallen straight from the sky, tower that will break the spine of the coming battle like a dry twig. "The ancestral spirits bless our march. They grant us not their mercy, but their fury, all their old, silent fury." BARZOG remained silent, but his silence was as eloquent as the stillness before a blow. His gaze slid slowly, almost reluctantly, from the shaman's face, from those eyes burning with prophetic fire, to his own axe. He examined the nicks on the blade, each dent and scar left by countless encounters with foreign iron, the dry, ingrained stains on the steel and the darkened wood of the half-brown, black, rusty, foreign blood. His own blood. He saw in it a reflection of his entire tribe, crude, enduring, disfigured by struggle, knowing and seeking no quarter from enemies nor, more importantly, from themselves. Then his eyes, those yellow, narrow slits, lifted again and met the burning gaze of the elder. There was no doubt in them now, no mute question, only a slow, heavy, stone-lifting realization. The realization that even the indifferent heavens had at last turned their gaze upon them, and were inscribing a new, fateful line in the eternal chronicle of their bloody deeds. BARZOG's nod was barely perceptible, just a slight, almost polite movement of his mighty head. But it was more than enough. The decision, already hard as the granite of his will, was now cast in unbreakable bronze by the heavenly omen, and forever sealed by the mysterious whisper of the spirits. And then Barzog the Black Spear turned to his people. He stepped with a heavy, assured tread onto the pile of flat stones that served as his throne and tribunal, and rose above the crowd of warriors gathered in the gray, cold pre-dawn twilight. The cold wind, the eternal wanderer of the steppe, tousled his tangled, grease and sweat-matted hair, but he himself seemed immovable as one of those stone pillars jutting from the plain, like the very inevitability of fate against which there is no recourse. His voice, when he began to speak, was not a shout, nor a commander's speech. It was a low, deep rumble born somewhere deep in his chest, like a subterranean tremor felt not with the ears, but through the feet, penetrating straight to the bone, making hearts beat in time with his own cold fury, drowning out all other sounds of the waking morning, the chirping of the first birds, the rustle of grass. Children of the ash skin, he began, and his words, crude and unhewn, fell into the silence like blows of a blacksmith's hammer on a hot anvil, driving into the consciousness of each, imprinting itself on memory. Your chieftain speaks to you. Barzog speaks to you. He swept his gaze over their faces, these rigid, immobile masks of scars and hardened skin, in whose eyes he read eternal hunger, blind loyalty, and that ancient, unquenchable thirst that knows no slaking but in hot blood, and the acrid smoke of burned-out enemy encampments. He saw in them not just warriors. He sought his own reflection, his crude continuation, the sole and primary instrument of his unyielding will. There, he gestured with his massive, scarred hand toward the east, where the sky was just beginning to lighten with a sickly, crimson glow like a fresh, oozing want. At our very doorstep have settled those who breathe our air and drink our water. Strangers, their blood knows not our songs. They have come to the fingers of the dead god and think this land is theirs. He paused, letting these words seep into their consciousness like a slow, corroding poison, destroying the last, faint traces of doubt or weariness. Their wargs are well-fed, their smoke, greasy and foreign, defiles our horizon. Do they think we have grown weak, that we have gone soft, like fat, sleepy pups warming themselves by a hearth fire? A low and ominous murmur, like the growl of a huge, hungry beast preparing to pounce, ran through the crowd, passing from the front ranks to the very back. Barzog saw fingers whitening on axe hafts, eyes yellowing and igniting with familiar predatory fire in the shadow of jutting brows. He saw that very fire he sought to kindle. No, he roared, and the sound, short and sharp, was like a thunderclap in the sudden silence, making even the hardiest, most seasoned warriors flinch. We are the Ash Skin Clan. Our fathers and our fathers' fathers lived and died in this dust. Their bones fertilize this earth. Their spirits watch us today from the very darkness, and they wait. They wait to see if in us they find their true children, orcs whose hearts beat in time with the stony heart of the steppe, or wretched, cowardly jackals to run with tails tucked and howl at the first sight of a foreign fire. He stepped forward to the very edge of the stone days, and his shadow, long, grotesquely distorted by the low sun, fell upon the first ranks of warriors, covering them like a black, soundless banner. I do not lead you to easy plunder. I lead you to what is ours by right of blood and strength, to victory, to blood. We will not simply kill them. We will wipe them from the face of the earth as one wipes dust from a hand. We will leave of their whole clan nothing but an ill memory and carrion for scavengers. Let their bones whiten under this sun, so that any who dare set foot on our land in the future may see at once and without words what awaits him here. We will be merciless. We will be iron and fire. We will be the hurricane that scorches all in its path, leaving not a blade of grass. His voice grew stronger, filling with a power accumulated in his line for generations, a power forged in countless skirmishes on tribal borders, suffered through in long, hungry times, tempered in the crucible of fierce hatred for all things foreign and encroaching. For every drop of our blood, they will pay with a whole river. For every breath we take with their death rattle, we will take their weapons, their spoils, their lives. And when we return to our fires, we will drink the bitter steppe water from bowls we carve from their own skulls. He drew his black spear, and its shaft fell with a dull, familiar thud into his calloused, battle-scarred palm. He raised it high to the sky, where a new, bloody day was dawning. The obsidian tip, black and cold, flashed like a shard of night itself, brought forth to terrify. For the land of our ancestors, for the air that sears our lungs, for the Ash Skin Clan, no quarter, no pity, only blood, only victory. His final words were drowned in a roar that burst from hundreds of throats at once. This was not just a cry, it was a vow carved into the air, the sound of rending flesh and breaking bones, a wild hymn to coming destruction, like the very exhalation of the steppe suddenly thirsting for blood. Axes, cleavers, spears shot upward, forming a forest of dull steel and blind fury, and the sun, rising over the horizon, reflected in hundreds of notched blades like tiny, pitiless suns ready to fall. Even the shaman, standing behind, raised his bony arms to the sky, his toothless mouth stretched in a silent cry of approval, his eyes filled with the same ancient madness as the warriors. The fury that had slumbered in the camp was now fully awakened, aimed like a spearhead and unleashed from its leash, and nothing could stop its swift, inexorable, bloody charge. They moved not as a disorderly, nosy mob, but as a single, breathing weapon, flowing from the stone basin slowly and menacingly, like thick, black lava from the mouth of an awakened ancient volcano. Hundreds of orcs of the Ash-Skin clan, each heart now a cauldron of the rage their chieftain had breathed into them. The earth trembled and hummed under the heavy, splayed paws of their wargs, these massive, wolf-like creatures whose shoulders and flanks were armored with crude, tendon-stitched hide plates, and from whose bared, slavering maws came a low, guttural, continuous growl, saturated with the same fierce hatred that blazed in their riders' hearts. The air filled with a continuous, frightening cacophony, the clang of steel on steel, the creak of taut leather straps and harnesses, the heavy, rhythmic tread of hundreds of feet, and the hoarse, snorting breath merging into a single, threatening symphony foretelling slaughter. This din carried far across the steppe, making small creatures flee in terror to their burrows and birds take wing with alarmed cries. At the very front, without looking back, astride his battle-warg, a titanic beast with fur the color of cold ashes and an old, white scar running across his muzzle, rode BARZOG the Black Spear. He did not glance back to see if they followed. He knew it with the same certainty as he knew day followed night. His back, straight and broad as a shield, was a mute symbol of their collective will, a reproach to the faint-hearted and the only banner for the furious. In his right hand, raised high, his black spear glittered in the piercing, cold morning sun. The obsidian tip seemed a living patch of darkness against the brightening sky, a hardened fragment of night brought forth to terrify. It was the axis, the core around which this gathering storm swirled, its inexorable center and sole guiding force. The orcs moved in a formation honed not by lawn drills, but by innate instinct and the bitter experience of countless skirmishes and ambushes. Young warriors, eyes burning with an unbearable mix of excitement and fury, pressed to front ranks, eager to prove their worth, to feel under their axes that sweet, dull crunch of enemy bone. The tribe's most experienced warriors, faces like leather cracked by time and weather, moved slightly slower, conserving strength. Their gazes, constantly sliding along the horizon and surrounding hills, were cold, empty, and incredibly calculating. They knew the true price of both blood and victory, remembered the taste of their own wounds and the death rattles of others. The shaman, astride his bony but incredibly hardy and vicious warg, rode not far from BARZOG. His lips whispered silent, ancient, guttural incantations, calling on spirits of fury and gloom, while his fingers, like dry, knotted twigs, gripped his staff of twisted, dark root in a dead man's clutch. The sun, climbing higher, cast long, grotesquely elongated shadows from the moving host. These black, shapeless stains crawled over the withered grass ahead of them, like an advance guard of death itself, a mute and distorted parody of the warriors that cast them. Behind lay the emptied camp, only extinguished, blackened fire pits, coals smoldering under ash, the indentations of tents on trampled earth, and an oppressive, total silence broken now only by the howling of the wind roaming the empty stone basin. The sound was like a moan from a deep grave. No road existed here, only a path forged by the will of the chieftain alone, a path that aimed straight across wormwood crunching underfoot and earth frozen like stone, toward the east to where the pillars of foreign smoke should soon be visible to the naked eye, a dirty, gray smear against the pale, cloudless sky. Thus they marched, a single, breathing organism woven of tensed muscle, dull steel, and one common, boiling rage. No one spoke a word. Only rarely came a stifled, hoarse roar from a war unable to bear the nervous tension of the long trek, or the dull clank of one warrior's armor brushing another's. Their silence was more eloquent than any war song or fierce oath, and it sounded the heavy, inexorable tread of fate itself, the creak of invisible scales on whose pans now lay hundreds of lives, their own and others. And at the head of this slow but unstoppable stream of steel, inevitable as fate's own blow, rode BARZOG, his yellow eyes constantly narrowed against the biting wind and bright light, already saw in the hazy distance that patch of earth which would become either their new spoils or their mass grave. A third outcome, as each knew, was not given. They marched for the remainder of the day, and the sun, reaching its zenith, began to beat down mercilessly on their tanned backs and broad shoulders. Sweat streamed along networks of old scars, mixing with road dust, running from chins and salty, burning rivulets, leaving white, saline streaks on sun-darkened skin. Dust, churned up by hundreds of feet, and heavy warg paws, hung in the air in a thick, russet pall. It mixed with the acrid smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and animal hair, creating a suffocating, almost tangible atmosphere of marching hardship and endurance around the column. By noon, many of the young warriors, unaccustomed to such treks, walked with mouths agape, breathing heavily, their faces pale with strain and fatigue. But not one dare utter a groan, complain, or slow his pace. All understood the simple and terrible truth: to fall behind meant certain, lonely death in this merciless steppe. And this thought kept them on their feet better than any order. At dusk, they did not stop. Barzog, sitting motionless on his warg, gave only a short, almost careless nod of his head to indicate the march continued. And this nod, this silent gesture, was enough for every one of them. Night fell upon the steppe swiftly thick, impenetrable, and chillingly cold. They moved in near total darkness, guided only by the chieftain's unfathomable instinct and the rare, tail pinpricks of stars glimmering in breaks in the clouds like sparse, cold tears on the face of the sky. Their long column became a winding, soundless shadow. The sounds of their movement muffled footfalls, suppressed, snorting growls from the wargs, occasionally broken by a stifled curse as someone stumbled over an unseen stone, seemed entirely swallowed by the indifferent, all-encompassing silence of the steppe. The steppe kept its age-old secrets and was in no hurry to yield them to strangers, even those bearing death within. Only the next morning, when the first thin, tail rays again began to gild the eastern edge of the sky, coloring it in watery, sickly hues, did Barzog slowly raise his hand. A wave of deceleration rolled down the long column until it came to a complete halt, and silence reigned, broken only by heavy, rasping breaths of tired creatures and the snorts of the wargs. They had stopped in a shallow, winding gully, sparsely grown with withered grass and a few crooked, stunted trees forever bent in obeisance to the constant steppe wind. The place was hidden from prying eyes, and from its floor the desired or dreaded smoke of the strangers was not visible. But Barzog, standing at the very edge of the gully, gazed precisely east. He did not see the enemy with his eyes, but felt its presence with every pore of his skin, catching an invisible, taut thread of threat stretched across many miles of slumbering steppe. A temporary camp arose quickly. Without fuss or unnecessary words, these orcs had done it dozens of times in their lives, and every movement of their calloused hands was honed by long years of nomadic life. They did not pitch tents, for the stop was brief. The warriors sat right on the cold, damp earth, untying time-cracked bags of tough dried meat and heavy, reeking waterskins with warm, stagnant water. Almost immediately, the scrape of whetstones began, drawing fresh, sharp grooves on notched axe and cleaver blades. This sound, dry, insistent, and monotonous, became the only permitted music in this refuge. No one lit fire. Smoke could rise in a column and betray their presence, and each understood this without reminder. They sat in silent, huddled groups, exchanging rare, abrupt phrases more akin to grunts or barks. Their eyes, reddened from lack of sleep, acrid dust, and tension, were fixed unwaveringly on the chieftain, awaiting his will, his sign. Barzog stood motionless, like a stone idol grown into the edge of the gully. He touched neither food nor water. He merely looked east, to where beyond that horizon the invisible target lay hidden. Sensing its hostile presence with his whole being, every muscle, every drop of his blood, his silence was an order understood by all without words. They had not come here to rest. They had come to await the night, to transform, with its coming, from warriors into shadows, from orcs into silence and death itself for those who had dare encroach on their land. And in the eyes of every orc sitting in that cold, wormwood-scented gully, the same thought now burned, a thought of the coming hours of darkness. That would be the stranger's last, a thought of a heavy axe sinking into flesh, of the coppery sweet taste of enemy blood on the tongue. The whole long, tortuous day the orcs spent without leaving the gully's shelter, lying in wait like a pack of hungry predators before a decisive leap. When every muscle is tense to trembling and ready to spring at any moment, the warriors dozed fitfully, sitting propped against the slopes or lying on their coarse hides. Their hands, even in sleep, instinctively clutched weapon hafts, and their dreams were filled with brief, bloody visions of the coming fray. Flashes of steel, cries, death rattles. Only rarely was the silence broken by a short, sleepy growl or the same scrape of whetstone on steel, muted by the monotonous rustle of the wind roaming the steppe and combing through the withered grass. On the slopes of their temporary refuge, one by one, silent as phantoms born of the steppe itself, the scouts returned. Their dark figures would silhouette briefly against the light sky on the gully's rim, then slide down just as soundlessly, dissolving into the gray-green, motionless mass of warriors. Each brought his report to BARZOG, who seemed never to have left his stone perch, his gaze unwaveringly fixed on the horizon line where the threat to their entire harsh way of life lay hidden. The first news was troubling, but generally expected. Reinforcements had come to the strangers. A small band, about 30, had approached from the north just before sunset the previous day, and the dust from their wargs' paws had slowly settled on the wormwood. The newcomers were met in the camp, and now the enemy's numbers had increased, promising a hotter, more protracted fight and, inevitably, greater losses on their own side. The second news made BARZOG slowly, with a quiet creak of tense muscles, turn his head. His yellow eyes narrowed to thin, burning slits in which a cold, silent fury congealed. The strangers had not simply made camp. They were felling young, sickly trees in a nearby hollow, driving sharpened, fire-hardened stakes into the ground, constructing a crude but sturdy palisade roof that capable of stopping a first, furious frontal assault. Others, sweating, were heaving stones, piling them into low, disorderly walls covering the approaches from the plain. This was no longer a temporary nomad encampment. It was a fortification, speaking of long-term plans, of calculation, of a settledness alien to orcs, of an intent to put down roots. The third news, brought by the most experienced and cunning of the scouts, his face a web of scars, was the most bitter and terrible. He had seen the strangers unloading their pack-orgs, weary beasts, but they unloaded not weapons or familiar supplies. He saw heavy leather sacks, tightly packed, like those used to store grain. He saw bundles of strange, unfamiliar tools for nomads, iron, blunt, with wide blades. And he saw them begin to dig a shallow, but wide pit right in the center of their camp. Its purpose was unclear to the scout, but the fact itself spoke of one terrible and undeniable thing. They were digging in the earth. They had not come simply to raid, to plunder, and leave. They had come to stay, to sink their foreign roots into land that by right of blood, by right of strength, and by right of age-old suffering belonged to the Ash-Skin clan alone. BARZOG listened without uttering a sound. His fingers gripped the shaft of his spear with such force that his knuckles whitened. Stark against his tanned skin, the air around him seemed to thicken and freeze, filling with a silent, wave-like fury emanating from him, the fury not just of a warrior, but of a guardian whose sanctum was being defiled. The shaman, sitting nearby, glanced anxiously at the chieftain. His old, trembling fingers unconsciously, with superstitious haste, ran over the bone amulets on his chest, as if trying to feel in them an answer, a sign from the spirits concerning this new, unprecedented outrage. The strangers had not merely crossed an invisible boundary. They were driving their stakes, their shovels, their intentions into the very flesh of the Ash-Skin clan's ancestral land. They were not just camping, they were building, digging, settling. They breathed their air and now intended to share their land, the land paved with the bones of their forefathers. This thought, heavy, poisonous, and cold as Lee, began slowly spreading through the gully, passing from warrior to warrior, not through words, but through silent, understanding glances, through suddenly clenched jaws, through quickened, whistling breath. This was no longer simply a raid for plunder, a dispute over pasture. This was war of total annihilation, and the night attack they had planned would now be not a lightning strike, but an act of ruthless, total vengeance meant to erase from the face of the earth not only the living enemies, but the very memory, the very possibility that anyone would dare consider this land their own. And then the shaman approached. His shadow, thin, bent, and trembling, fell upon BARZOG, lay upon his powerful shoulders like a cloak woven of the oldest darkness, of age-old fears and vague prophecies. The air around the elder shimmered with a strange heat, seeming to emanate not from the sun, but from his own dried-up body, from his robes of tanned hide and yellowed feathers that smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and something elusively ancient, a scent older than the clan itself, older than any song. He stopped 2 paces away, leaning on his dark, time-polished staff of twisted root. His eyes, murky and deep as forest pools where light drowns, fixed on the chieftain, boring into him, seeking in his immobile features a response, an understanding of the tidings he now bore, a message from the very foundations, the very roots of this cruel world. "The spirits of the earth speak with me," the shaman whispered, and his voice was not like an orc speech, but like a natural sound of the steppe, the rustle of dried grass under an unseen paw, the quiet, chilling creak of old bones ground by the wind in the depths of forgotten barrows. "They are wrathful, Barzog," they groan. "The strangers drive their sharp stakes into the living flesh of the steppe, wound the silent stones with their crude tools. The earth groans under their weight, and this groan, it resonates in my very bones. It wakes the ancestral spirits who slept in their grave mounds, and now they stir. And in their waking there is naught but one thirst to slake their ancient, mute fury." Barzog remained silent, unmoving, like a stone effigy carved by wind and time. But his mighty, white-scarred fingers clenched the spear shaft so hard his knuckles whitened, and beads of sweat stood out on his tanned skin, mingling with the age-old dust ground into his pores. He felt the truth of these words not only with his ears, he felt it with all his skin, all his flesh. He felt it in the very soil beneath his feet, in how the wind, always free and wild, now seemed to bump against something alien, solid and hostile, bringing from the east not only the smell of foreign smoke but the distant, measured, hateful thud of foreign hammers on stone. In his soul, simple and direct as an axe blow, there now rose not just a warrior's decision to go into battle. There arose the fury of a keeper, a priest, whose sanctum had been defiled. A fury older than himself, rooted in the very bones of his ancestors, whose spirits now did not sleep in their barrows, but stood beside him, unseen and thirsting. "Our ancestors," the shaman continued, his words flowing slowly, thickly, like dark, heavy honey, filling the narrow space between them with a heavy, almost tangible power. "The smell of smoldering sacred roots and dry, bitter wormwood, grant us now not surprise, good for thieves. They grant us the wrath of the earth itself. They will show a path where stones and gullies themselves will shield our approach with their black shadows, where the earth itself will become our ally and guide. They will whisper fury into the warriors' hearts, a fury hotter than any fire's flame, and colder than the deepest, piercing night ice." The elder paused. His gaze, usually fixed on invisible, otherworldly distances, suddenly became piercing, sharp, and incredibly alive, like a honed obsidian point. He stared straight into Barzog's yellow eyes, trying to penetrate to the very core of his being, to read there a silent answer to the call of the ancient powers. "That the spirits," he hissed, and a metallic, pitiless note sounded in his voice, "demand a price for the defilement. They crave not simply victory, not blood for blood. They crave extermination, total, complete, without remainder, so that not one of the defilers, not a single one, carries his legs away from this land, so that the ash of their fires forever mingles with our dust, and their names and memory of them are struck from the book of the world as if they had never been." Barzog slowly nodded. It was a movement of immense gravity, as if a mountain had inclined its stone peak, accepting the inevitability of an avalanche. Cold resolve, hard and inexorable as ice at the heart of an iceberg, froze in his yellow eyes, quenching the last gleams of anything living that might still have smoldered there. No room remained for doubt, nor a shadow of mercy, only a bottomless, silent readiness to fulfill the will of the spirits and his own will as chieftain, whose ancient, blood-written law had now been trampled in the most monstrous way. Now every warrior of the Ash-Skin clan must become not just a fighter, but an instrument of retribution, a living embodiment of wrath, and every blow, every swing of an axe must not merely take life, but cleanse the land, washing away the defilement with whole rivers of foreign, warm blood. Night fell upon the steppes, suddenly black, thick, and starless, as if the darkness itself had condensed to liquid and clung to the earth, swallowing all colors, outlines, sounds. No crescent moon, not a single spark in the celestial heights, only impenetrable, blind gloom, broken only occasionally, like a sigh, by a gust of wind whispering something in the dry grass, as if warning or mourning. And in this living, breathing dark, movement began, quiet, slow, inexorable, like the flow of subterranean waters deep within. They moved in silence, a ghostly, stretched-out procession emerging from the gully's belly. Their dark bodies merged with the blackness of night so completely they seemed part of it. Not a single war cry, no horn sound, only the muffled, whisper like rasp of coarse hide on cold stone, to barely audible scrape of war claws on frozen earth, and the restrained, rasping breath of many throats. Barzog walked ahead, his massive silhouette merely guessed at in the dark. He led them not by sight. Eyes were nearly useless in this gloom, but by that inner, predatory instinct that pointed the way straight to the heart of the enemy camp. The instinct of a wolf on a blood trail. Behind him, stepping precisely in his footsteps, moved his warriors' faceless, soundless shadows, in which only rarely did narrow, gleaming points flash and die, the glint in eyes filled with mute and final resolve. The first to fall were the sentries on the outer approaches. Two stranger orcs, leaning against a large boulder, lazily exchanging hoarse phrases and low voices, sharing scraps of dried meat. They did not see the shadows detach from the impenetrable dark can creep toward them, did not hear the stealthy, cautious steps, did not scent the smell of approaching death, that cold, metallic scent preceding it. Only a short, cut-off gurgle, a stifled, bubbling choke and throw seized by a mighty hand, and their bodies, gone limp, slid silently to the cold ground, yielding place to the next silent phantoms who stepped over the still warm corpses without slowing. The sentries right by the palisade were more alert. One of them, leaning on his spear shaft, peered tensely into the dark velvet of night, his hand tightening on the woe, when he thought he glimpsed some movement at the edge of vision, too smooth for the wind. But the shadow that separated from the common wall of gloom was faster than his dawning alarm. An iron-strong grip seized his throat, crushing the cry beginning to form. In the same instant, a long, double-edged knife slid under the leather armor, finding with unerring accuracy the narrow target, the gap between ribs, and reached the heart with a short, sure thrust. The second sentry, standing at the fortification's corner, hearing a suspicious, wet sound, turned. His fingers instinctively reached for the war horn at his belt, but it was too late. A heavy axe, with hundreds of deaths to its credit, cleaved the damp tear and crashed down on his head with a short, wet, bony crunch. The body slumped to the ground like a felled sheaf. Thus, step by step, silently and methodically, like a well-oiled and soulless mechanism of destruction, Barzog's orcs cut through the outer ring of the enemy's guard. No alarm, no cry disturbed the night's silence. Only occasionally came a muffled, cut-off groan, the soft thud of a falling body, or the distinct crack of breaking bone, sounds immediately swallowed by the indifferent, eternal whisper of the steppe itself, never reaching the ears of those who slept in the camp, still ignorant of their fate. The fury of the Ash-Skin clan, built up through the long day of waiting, poured forth not in wild cries, but in this chilling, silent work of cold iron and precise, measured movements, each a mute but eloquent answer to the defilement of their land. And then, when the last sentry on the outer perimeter had been silently removed, to silence that ringing, tense silence preceding a storm finally shatter, to first scream, piercing, torn, and full of pure animal terror, ripped through the night when one of the strangers, stepping out of a tent to relieve himself, stumbled over the still warm, sticky body of his own sentry. The scream was echoed at once by others, rising from different parts of the camp, hoarse, confused shouts of alarm, desperate calls to arms, incoherent wails from those caught by fury and fear in the depths of sleep, on sleeping hides, in total darkness and without a hint of armor. The camp's sleepy stupor gave way to chaotic, mad movement, like a stirred-up anthill. From the pens came an answering, deep, agitated growling of the strangers' wargs, scenting the familiar smell of blood and, more terribly, the smell of their orcs' panicked fear. Soon this growling was joined by deep, quickening thuds against wooden barriers, and rage and frightened beasts strained for freedom, sensing approaching calamity in their hearts. Barzog's wargs, silent until now, held in check by the iron hand and will of their riders, answered them with their own voice, low, furious, full of ancient, unreasoning battle lust. They surged forward with the warriors, their massive, muscular bodies, daring riders, knocked down the first day's strangers rushing from tents. Mighty jaws, capable of snapping a mail-gloved arm, crunched collarbones with a sickening sound, tore throats, ripped out chunks of flesh. But from the enemy's side, their own beasts were already leaping free from the pen's huge, well-fed creatures covered in old battle scars. They threw themselves under the attackers' feet, seized arms and legs, trying to halt the steel, organized onslaught at the cost of their own lives, creating a bloody, growling barrier. The strangers scrambled up, bumping into each other in the press of tents, grabbing the first thing at hand, axes left by entrances, short, jagged knives, even gnawed bones that in their desperate hands became a pitiful semblance of clubs. They poured out, blind from abruptly broken sleep and instantly flaring, wild rage, and collided face to face with the silent, dense, wall-like wedges of BARZOG's warriors. The attackers' faces in the pre-dawn dark seemed like stone-carved masks, from which only one emotion looked upon the enemy: cold, indifferent, inexorable death. Now there was no place for silence. It was trampled, torn to shreds, destroyed. The air filled with the deafening clash of steel on steel, the heavy, snorting grunts of struggling bodies, the dull, bone-breaking thuds of axes on shields, armor, and living bone, desperate, incoherent cries in a foreign, guttural tongue that no one now understood or tried to understand. The first furious skirmishes flared out by the barely smoldering night fires. In the flickering, uneven light of the last tons of flame, twisted grimaces of pain and frenzy flashed, eyes glinted with terror or rage. Sprays of spittle and blood, almost black in this light, flew, all mingled with acrid smoke and churned up dust, creating a suffocating, hellish atmosphere in which there was no room for thought or pity, only the instinct to kill or be killed. One of BARZOG's young warriors, eyes burning like two hot coals, came to engross chasing a wounded, retreating stranger orc. He did not notice how from the side, behind an overturned wagon, an enemy warg, its fur dappled with autumn colors, leaped at him, silent and swift as a mottled shadow. The beast sank its teeth into his shoulder, and in the night silence sounded a clear, dry, soul-chilling crack of a breaking collarbone. The wounded warrior did not even scream, only uttered a hoarse, choking sound before a nearby old, gray orc felled the creature with one heavy, unhurried, and deadly precise stroke of his axe. The youth, bleeding, wheezing, gritting his teeth against unbearable pain, got up, pressing his palm to the bloody, unnaturally twisted wound. Then, picking up his dropped knife from the ground, he staggered forward again, into the very thick of the carnage, for there was nowhere to retreat behind lay only the cold steppe, and certain death from blood loss alone. Ahead the same death, but in battle, and this was the only solace he could still hope for. Some tall stranger, with a heavy cleaver in hand, managed for a moment to become an island of order in this sea of chaos. Gathering a few bewildered but unbroken kinsmen around him, he repelled the attackers with a furious, organized counterthrust. His hoarse, rasping command roar, full of wild determination, rose above the general din of battle, instilling in his warriors' hearts a ghostly but burning hope. But from the swirling dark can smoke, as if the very shadow of retribution incarnate, stepped BARZOG, his black spear, knowing no miss or hesitation, described a short, economical, lethal arc and drove into the exposed, screaming throat of the stranger. The roar cut off at its highest note, choked by a gushing stream of dark blood. BARZOG's mighty hands were already turning the shaft, with habitual, almost careless ease wrenching the wide tip from flesh and shattered bone, and the body crashed at his feet like a felled tree. The slaughter, begun in chaos, now swiftly, with horrifying inevitability, turned into a methodical, ceaseless butchering, unable to form up, without a single plan, deprived of their leader. The strangers fell one by another under the precise, masterstroke blows of the ash-skin warriors. For the attackers, this night was not simply a fight for plunder or survival, it was the execution of the spirit's will, an act of cleansing their native land, a sacred duty paid in blood. But they, too, paid their price. A spear thrown true from the dark lodged in the throat of an orc just beginning a boastful, victorious cry, and the sound ended in a gurgle. An old warrior, fighting off three attackers with silent fury, tripped over a gutted body and, losing balance, was chopped down by a heavy blow to the back before he could even cry out or rise. They hacked, stabbed, and finished off, leaving not the slightest chance for quarter or surrender. The earth beneath their feet, once frozen and hard, quickly turned into a slippery, sticky, sucking mire, soaked with warm, almost hot blood that was greedily drunk in by the cold soil, as if the steppe itself opened mouths to drink, inflicting upon itself deep, bloody wounds. BARZOG hurled his spear at another stranger orc who ran to meet him, piercing through leather armor and body, and with a mighty, practiced motion shrugged his two-handed axe from his shoulder. Its blade, broad as a spade and pitted with numerous nicks from past battles, glimmered in the crimson reflections of the dying fires with a dull, insatiable light. He gripped the haft with both hands, feeling the familiar surface under his fingers, and his whole body from the powerful, knotted shoulders to the feet planted in the bloody muck became a single, living, perfectly balanced mechanism of death, a tool of destruction devoid of thought and doubt. The first blow was like a ram striking rickety gates. It fell upon a stranger orc trying to shield himself with a crude, hastily assembled wooden buckler. The shield didn't just crack, it exploded into sharp splinters, and the heavy blade, meeting no further resistance, passed through shoulder and chest, nearly cleaving the opponent into with a juicy crunch. BARZOG, not pausing, not even glancing at the result, wrenched the axe free with a powerful reverse motion, and warm, salty spray hit his face, mixing with sweat and soot. He moved forward, and the space around him seemed to clear by itself, forming a bloody clearing littered with shattered weapons, torn bucklers, and body parts. His axe described why, crushing arcs that knew no parrying, no blocking, only unrestrained, overwhelming force. He chopped straight through enemy blades, snapping them like dry twigs. He chopped at hands raised in defense, severing wrists with weapons still clenched in fingers. He chopped at leather helmets and heads, and skulls parted under the blade with a dull, wet crunch lost in the general din of hell but resonating in the bones of all nearby. One of the strangers, young and fierce, with the madness of desperation in his eyes, tried to duck under a swing and drive a short, jagged knife into the chieftain's unprotected side. But BARZOG seemed to see everything around as if slow, with a piercing inner sight, catching every movement in this chaotic dance of death. He did not divert his heavy axe, wasting precious instant. Instead, he delivered a short, sharp blow with the haft straight into the attacker's face. The youth flew aside like a rag doll, his mouth smashed to a bloody pulp, teeth shattering. The next swing of the axe, smooth and inescapable as a guillotine's fall, caught another enemy who had just cut down one of his warriors, and split his skull from temple to neck, exposing for a moment pink-gray matter before the body collapsed. No technique, no desperate skill could withstand this raw, primeval force multiplied by cold, calculated, and absolute fury. BARZOG moved through the crowd like a pitiless reaper through a field of ripe wheat, and behind him remained only heaps of mutilated bodies, wreckage, and pools of congealing, sticky blood. His breathing was even and deep, his face an immobile stone mask from which slow, dark rivulets of foreign blood ran, caking in the deep grooves of old scars. Every blow of his axe was not merely an act of killing, it was an affirmation of power, absolute and terrible, a message carved in steel and flesh to those who dared dispute his right to this land, this air, the very fact of his existence. And this message all understood without translation, reading it in each new, still twitching corpse. While BARZOG sowed death with his axe, an equally cruel and wild battle raged on the ground between the wargs. Bereft of direction in the general tumult, these fierce beasts obey only ancient, prehistoric instincts older than any tribal feud. Two wargs, the ash-gray one of BARZOG's clan and a stranger's, covered in old, grizzled scars, met in the camp's center with a crash like falling ancient trees. They reared, bearing yellow, dagger-curved fangs, and fell upon each other in clouds of dust and flying spittle. The ash-gray one sank its teeth into the opponent's neck, even as it was itself drenched in blood from a deep wound in its side where the stranger had bitten. An instant earlier, they rolled on the ground, now mixed with blood and filth, tearing out tufts of each other's fur and flesh, their growls turning to hoarse, deathly screams full of pain and frenzy. Other wargs darted through the camp, blinded by rage and the all-pervasive smell of blood, no longer distinguishing friend from foe. One, with a broken, dragging leg, pounced on a wounded stranger orc sitting clutching a slashed belly, and began tearing at his throat, while the orc feebly, almost soundlessly, fended it off with his good arm. Another beast, maddened by pain and the intoxicating stench, seized the leg of a fallen ash-skin warrior and with wild fury began to shake it, tearing muscle from bone with a disgusting, squelching sound. Wounded orcs from both sides, having already forgotten in this common cauldron of suffering who was friend or foe, tried to rise, clutching at discarded weapons, at blood-slick stones, at cold, stiffened bodies of the fallen comrades and enemies alike. A young warrior of BARZOG, with a deep, gaping wound on his thigh from which bloody foam seeped, crawled to a stranger trying to bind his arm with a scrap of dirty hide, and drove a spear fragment into his eye, finishing him with a last effort of will. An old, grey orc from the stranger clan, bleeding from a cleaved shoulder, with a final, convulsive effort struck down a young orc of BARZOG's clan with a fist clutching a bloody stone, and falling upon him, began to crush his throat with a trembling but unrelenting hand until he fell still, spitting out a last bloody bubble. No one screamed anymore, called for help. Only heavy, rasping, whistling breath, death rattle gurgles in torn throats, the gnashing of teeth in pain or fury, and dull, weedy thuds filled the ringing air now. The slaughter was entering its final, darkest stage, the stage of methodical, pitiless, pedantic extermination, where no room remained for captives, quarter, or even the thought of mercy. What had begun as a sudden night attack had now become a cleansing of territory, an act of complete, total erasure of an entire enemy tribe from the face of the earth. As one erases an unwanted mark from sand, the ash-skin warriors, now coated in indistinguishable layers of foreign and their own blood, sticky sweat, and filth, moved between the smoldering fires and rent tents. They sought out survivors, moving deliberately and attentively, like reapers gathering the last fallen ears in an emptied field. A young orc with a broken, unnaturally twisted arm, leaning on the bloody haft of his axe, finished off wounded strangers with precise, economical throat or rib thrusts. Not looking into their clouding eyes, an old warrior, limping and favoring a stiff leg, walked the battlefield and with his heavy, polished two-machine cleaver methodically, without emotion, dispatched those who still showed signs of life, whose chests rose faintly, whose fingers twitched. Even the wounded warriors of BARZOG, sitting or lying on the ground, cut the throats of despairing enemies crawling past with their long, sharp knives. Their movements were slow from pain and blood loss, but no less inexorable and final. The wargs, utterly deranged by the all-consuming, intoxicating smell of blood and wounded flesh, prowled among the bodies like shadows, seeking easy prey. To tore at a still warm corpse, snarling fiercely at each other, ripping out chunks of muscle, exposing whitening ribs. Another beast dragged a severed, mutilated arm until a larger, stronger rival snatched the prize away, stunning it with a blow from a mighty paw. BARZOG, still clutching his gigantic axe, its blade now dull and tacky with congealed blood, walked slowly across the battlefield. He walked like a master surveying his domain after a storm, coldly and indifferently assessing the damage. His eyes, holding not a trace of the recent fury, slid over the heaps of bodies, seeing in them now only the final proof of his power and will fulfilled. He stopped over a young stranger trying to crawl with a broken spine, leaving a long, dark, wet trail behind him. The chieftain looked at him without hatred, without gloating, and with one precise, almost merciful blow of the axe, ended his suffering. It was an act not of pity, but of completing the work. The shaman, having taken no direct part in the slaughter, stood at the edge of the battlefield, on a small rocky rise, fumbling with dry fingers at the amulet on his chest. He whispered gratitude to the spirits for the granted victory, and an insistent plea to accept the souls of all the fallen, without distinction, enemies and his own alike, for death had leveled all. The last, desperate, almost senseless cries died away, one by one, yielding to an ominous, oppressive, almost physically palpable silence. It was broken only by the crunch of bones under heavy boots and the deep, satisfied growling of the wargs already feasting on carrion. BARZOG swept his gaze over the entire battlefield, this broad, dark silhouette-strewn space where foreign life had teemed just hours before. His chest rose and fell heavily, evenly. Steam from his rapid breathing plumed into the cold, clear morning air in thick, quickly dissolving clouds, mingling with the acrid smoke of smoldering remnants and the all-pervading, coppery sweet smell of death that would now forever be part of this place. Search everything. BARZOG's voice sounded hoarse, with that authoritative, silence-cutting clarity that brooked no delay, no questions. It cut through the sinister, heavy calm that had settled after the carnage like a dull knife through hide. Any who stir finish them, to the last. Take all the iron, all the high, all the water, everything of use, leave nothing. His words, short and hard as a whip crack, made the warriors, exhausted too near death, almost falling from weariness, startle and set to work again. Ancient, bone-deep discipline of scavengers and looters overcame fatigue. The orcs, with dull, automatic obedience, began methodically turning everything over, tearing into every nook, checking if anyone played dead, holding breath and squeezing eyes shut. Short, reliable knives, clutched in calloused hands, found their unerring mark sliding under ribs, into throats, into the base of skulls of the few who tried to hide, whose chests betrayed them with faint rises from fear or whose fingers twitched involuntarily. Young warriors, fighting back nausea from the reek and their own hollowed-out exhaustion, dragged enemy axes with bent blades, time and weather-cracked bags of half-rotten meat, heavy, musty-smelling waterskins of warm, murky water to growing, shapeless piles of plunder. Others, squatting right in the sticky muck, with deft, practiced motions stripped still intact leather armor from fallen strangers. Cut off strings of bone amulets and clusters of feather talismans. These fell into common sacks with a dry, clattering sound like thrown pebbles. The wargs, sensing relative calm, immediately began their bloody feast. They prowled among the bodies, snapping over the best pieces, their low, deep, contented growling and loud, smacking, repulsive feeding filled the air, mixing with the creak of high, the clank of iron, and the heavy breathing of orcs, creating a background symphony of despoliation. Barzog stood motionless as one of the steppe stone pillars, watching with a cold, appraising eye as his clan, surviving and victorious, gathered its bloody due, the lawful, hard-won price of victory and stilled blood. He looked upon this emptied, trampled, wounded place where foreign life had teemed just hours before, where tents had stood and fires burned, and in his yellow, narrow, slit-like eyes there was no victor's triumph, no sorrow for their own losses, only a cold, stony, deep satisfaction of duty fulfilled, duty to the bones of ancestors and the very flesh of the land. The will of the spirits had been done. The earth had slaked its ancient thirst with enemy blood, and now, sated, would calm for a time. Licking its wounds, he walked slowly among the bodies, his heavy, crude boots making a squelching sound in the sodden, turned to brown slurry earth. His gaze, cold and expectant, slid methodically over the heaps of dead orcs until it found what he sought. He stopped over the body of the tall stranger with the heavy cleaver, the very one whose commander he had cut short with his spear. The opponent's lifeless face, turned to the bleak, indifferent sky, was frozen in a mask of final, petrified surprise and mute, useless rage. "Drag him there," Barzog commanded. His voice, hoarse from recent fury and strain, was not loud, but carried that same incontestable, habitual authority that made men obey instantly, without thought. A pair of nearby warriors, asking no questions, immediately bent, seized the bloody limbs, and hauled the heavy corpse toward the camp center. They left a dark, shiny wet trail on the trampled, ravaged earth. Without another word, without any explanation or ritual cry, Barzog raised his heavy, freshly and oldly notched axe. The blade flashed in the cold morning light, describing a short, mercilessly efficient arc. A dull, bony crunch, like the snapping of a dry twig under Bhutan. The head separated from the torso, crimson, almost black in this light. Blood gushed from the exposed neck onto the earth. But the chieftain was already kneeling on one knee. His fingers, strong and tenacious as roots, gripped the tangled, filthy, blood-caked hair of the dead man. Drawing a long, serrated knife from his belt, he set to work. He did it with methodical, almost ritual cruelty, without a trace of disgust, without a hint of doubt or extra emotion. The blade stripped skin and muscle from bone, making a wet, repulsive, squelching sound clearly audible in the silence that had followed his command. Not a muscle twitched in his stone, blood-caked face as he cleaned the skull, carefully cutting away remnants of flesh, scooping out the contents of the eye sockets with the long, curved tip of the blade. Soon all that remained in his hand was a whitish, still damp, and pink in patches skull, ugly, terrible in its naked, anatomical truth. Seeing this, several orcs, in whose eyes still glowed the amber of fury not yet cooled after the slaughter, with hoarse, approving shouts, set about their own imitative work. They drew knives and began on other, still warm bodies of fallen strangers. Soon, across the camp, above the general hum, crawled the familiar, soul-chilling scrape of steel on bone and the revolting, wet sounds of separating flesh. One by one they raised their trophies, freshly cleaned skulls, from which scarlet moisture dripped in rare, thick drops onto the earth. These nameless faces, lifeless, with empty sockets and teeth forever bare, in a silent scream, now became mute witnesses to the triumph of the Ash-Skin clan and an ominous, wordless warning to any who might dare set foot on their path in the future. When the last body had been searched and the last leather sack, tightly stuffed with crooked blades, strings of bone trinkets, and creaking waterskins, had been cinched with a rawhide thong, Barzog, standing on a small elevation of hastily piled stones and corpses, silently, without effort, raised his hand. This simple, uncomplicated gesture was enough. The tribe, as one weary organism, moved on the return path. They left behind a field strewn with dark, motionless silhouettes against a gradually lightening but no less bleak and cold sky. Over this field, the first carrion birds were already beginning to circle, their mournful, greedy cries breaking the silence, as if nature itself was awakening from a nightmare to begin its own, unhurried feast. They walked the same path as the day before, but now their procession was heavy, agonizingly slow, stumbling. It was burdened not only by the weight of plunder sacks, bundles, sheaves, but by a deathly, bone-deep weariness, that special emptiness following the adrenaline of fury. The warriors dragged tight-packed loads on their broad, lash-scarred and now further burdened shoulders, their faces, under a thick, cracked carapace of dried mud, sweat, and caked blood, seemed lifeless stone masks. Behind these masks lay only a deaf, almost animal exhaustion, a desire to fall and not move. Those who had taken wounds, one with a deep, gaping gash on his thigh, another with an unnaturally twisted, purpled arm, leaned on the shoulders of their slightly sturdier kin, their legs, buckling, left an uneven, broken trail on the trampled earth, in which here and there, like an accusation, showed the fresh red of reopened wounds. The wargs, laden with bundles of rough, uncured hide, walked with their massive, one-sprout heads lower, their usually shaggy fur now matted into dreadful, dark from blood and dust clumps. Mighty flanks rose and fell heavily with a whistling sound, issuing broken, rasping snorts. The few beasts not bearing loads ran along the column's flanks, but their usual, menacing growling had become deep, hoarse, and tired, devoid of former aggression, merely stating total, irrevocable exhaustion. Barzog walked at the front, as befitted a chieftain. His back remained unnaturally straight, as if carved from solid granite, but every step, striking the frozen earth with a dull thud, now came with visible, heavy effort. It seemed not only the physical fatigue of battle lay upon his shoulders, but all the invisible weight of the decision taken, the weight of lives cut short, both enemy and his own. In one hand he clutched, like a scepter, the shaft of his titanic axe, blackened and sticky with sweat and blood. In the other, on a coarse, sinew-woven cord, dangled the freshly cleaned skull of the enemy chieftain. With each step it thumped dully and monotonously against his mighty, bare and equally befouled shin, like a sinister metronome counting the steps of the long return journey. They walked in silence. No one looked back at the place of slaughter left behind, where over the heaps of bodies a low, black circle of vultures was closing. No one spoke a word, no victorious, boastful cries, no groans from the wounded, only a deep, all-consuming, weary silence, broken by the creak of hide on high, heavy, wheezing breath, and the measured, tired, merging into one sound of many feet tramping. This tramping echoed in the ringing, cold air of the coming day, like a funeral march. Behind lay death and utter, hopeless desolation. Ahead, in the heart of the harsh, pitiless steppe, awaited their camp, their stony basin, their land, awaited their cruel, simple, illusionless life, which already continued its eternal, inexorable circle, demanding no, exacting new and new sacrifices. They reached their stone basin only on the second day, when the sun already stood high and merciless, illuminating tired, gaunt, blackened faces and fresh, red, inflamed scars showing through layers of ingrained filth and caked blood. The camp met them not with jubilant cries, but with an ominous, frighteningly empty silence broken only by the lonely, mournful howling of wind in the rocks. This wind roamed between extinguished fires and empty, bowl-like tent poles. The warriors, without a word, with dull, automatic obedience, set to work silently unloading trophies into piles, binding ragged wounds with dirty, wet rags, spreading out surviving, smoke-reeking tents. The air filled with familiar sounds, the creak of high, the dull, meaningless clang of weapons being dragged into heaps, and the heavy, broken, rasping breath of creatures wearied to the very depths of their souls. It was then, as Barzog stood by his blackened, cold fire pit giving final, short, abrupt orders about distributing plunder and tending the wounded, that he first felt it. Not a sound. His ears were filled with the familiar, lulling noise of camp grunts, creaks, indistinct speech. This was different. A vague, formless summons, rising somewhere in the darkest, most hidden depth of his being, beyond ordinary hearing, in those corners that answer not to reason but to instinct, to vague presentiment, to the call of blood. It pulled from the south, from where the sun-scorched steppes met the distant, ashen-gray peaks of unfamiliar mountains, like ash after a great fire. It was a voiceless but insistent, imperious call, cold and heavy, like the echo of a blow on a giant bronze comb somewhere beyond the world's edge. A blow felt not with ears, but in the very bones, every cell of his weary body. It drew, beckoned, promising something incredibly ancient, long forgotten and therefore frightening, dangerously powerful. Barzog frowned his low, sloping, wrinkle-carved brow. His yellow, predatory eyes, usually so clear in their simplicity, narrowed to thin, wary slits. Almost against his own will, he slowly turned his massive head southward, listening into the emptiness, the silence of the steppe, trying to catch the source of this inner pressure. His gaze slid to the shaman. The elder sat by his own separate, smoldering like his life fire, calmly, with habitual concentration, sorting through amulets and talismans brought from the battlefield. His old, toothless lips moved soundlessly, whispering thanks to the spirits for the granted victory. He did not raise his head, did not startle, not a muscle twitched on his desiccated, decapable face, nothing, not the slightest spark in his eyes. No tension in his posture betrayed that he felt the same all-penetrating, inexplicable call. And then Barzog, an orc whose whole life from birth to this hour had been woven of simple steel, direct fury, and no less simple, straightforward decisions, with an effort, almost physical, rejected the sensation, pushed it away like a bothersome flying. A phantom summons from nowhere was not worth his attention. It was weariness, he thought. The hum in the blood after battle, a trick of the mind heated by slaughter and long march. An illusion born of emptiness after duty done. Yes, only that. He turned sharply, irritably, back to giving orders, and his voice, hoarse and habitually commanding, thundered over the camp again, drowning out the insistent whisper in his own blood. Life, harsh and simple, was taking its course. Plunder had to be divided, losses counted, wounds licked. The eternal wheel of life in the steppe turned onward. But somewhere in the deepest recess of his consciousness, like a splinter driven deep into flesh, lodged this troubling thought. He had sensed something, and the shame in the voice of the spirit said naught. And this silence of the elder, this deafness of his, troubled Barzog far more than the phantom, insistent call itself. He began to wake at night from this voiceless, but no less insistent hum, and lay sleepless, staring into the dark beneath the ceiling of his tent where amulets of claws and teeth hung, glinting dully in the faint light of the hearth's embers. The camp lay in its familiar, lulling night silence, broken only by sentry calls and the restrained growls of wargs. But for Barzog this silence was deceptive. His inner world brimmed with the insistent, pulsing hum, demanding and inexorable as the voice of fate, like the beating of some alien, mighty heart somewhere underground. And this inner roar was louder than any external sound. He tried to drown it out with grueling labor, participating in training with doubled, almost frantic fury, personally checking every gap in the camp's defenses, every nick on his warriors' weapons. But even when his muscles burned from exhaustion and his mind grew foggy with physical depletion, the hum continued to sound somewhere deep within, like red-hot metal slowly cooling in his very chest, reminding him with a dull, throbbing ache that was not in the muscles, but at the very core of his being. You hear it? Barzog rasped into the air one day, not looking at the elder. The shaman slowly raised his murky, almost blind eyes, in which two tiny sparks reflected the fire's tongues. He seemed to surface from a deep sleep where he had seen other things, and the world of the camp now seemed to him ghostly and unimportant. I hear the wind, chieftain, and the crackle of fire, nothing more. Not the wind, Barzog ground out, crushing a half-gnawed piece of me in his mighty fist until the bone showed. Tendons stood out on his arm like ropes. Something else, from beyond the mountains. The shaman tilted his head, listening to the familiar night sounds of the steppe, the rustle of wormwood. A distant howl. Then slowly, with unruffled calm, shook his wrinkled, decapable head. His lips, thin and pale, moved soundlessly, as if counting old incantations like beads. The spirits are silent about the south, Barzog. They speak only of our land, of the blood we spilled, of the bones that fertilize the steppe, of our clan's strength. He stared at the chieftain with a serene, almost empty gaze, and Barzog with sudden, chilling clarity understood that the elder truly heard and felt nothing. For the shaman, the whole world was filled only with the voices of ancestors and the whisper of spirits of this steppe, this patch of earth scorched by sun and frozen by winds. What troubled Barzog lay beyond his perception, beyond his ancient, established rituals, beyond that line where songs by the fire ended and something voiceless and airless began. What could a chieftain say? What words describe something that had neither sound, nor form, nor smell, yet was more real and sharper than any blade in his hand? This inexplicable secret became his lonely, heavy burden, A quiet but deep crack in the unbreakable rock of his will, a crack that widened with each passing day, threatening to split the granite fortress of his spirit. And he felt the cold draft penetrating the fissure ever more distinctly. He began to notice how his attention, usually sharp as a razor's edge, scattered during councils or while observing training. The shaman's words about omens and the will of the spirits flew past his ears, drowned in that constant hum that had become the unchanging background of his existence. Even the taste of fresh meat from the hunt seemed bland and lifeless to him, as if all the world's colors and smells had dimmed before this insistent inner call that overrode everything like a gray, impenetrable veil. At night, standing at the very southern edge of the camp, he felt the call become almost tangible, dense as fog. He began to imagine that in the very darkness a barely noticeable, silvery thread shimmered, stretched from the south and tied directly to his heart, invisibly tugging him onward. Sometimes, almost unaware of his actions, he would reach a hand into the void, and his fingers would instinctively clench, trying to grasp the invisible, to catch the source of this ceaseless whisper. But his palm held only the cold stream of night wind. His decisions, always swift and uncontested, became less immediate. Where before he acted without a shadow of hesitation, now short but noticeable pause arose, a moment in which the hum had time to whisper something in a forgotten, ancient tongue understandable to him alone. The warriors began to notice this change, exchanging worried glances on the sly when their chieftain froze mid-command. Staring at a point to the south, his face contorted in a strange, detached grimace, as if listening to a voice from a deep well of memory to which they, simple warriors, had no access. But the most terrible thing was that in these moments of detachment, the call began to take vague shape, not yet an image, but a coagulation of sensations of cold, soulless splendor, of ancient, otherworldly power, of airless and soundless void. It both frightened and lured, like a beckoning, dark abyss one longs to peer into, even knowing with one's whole being that there is no return from it. And in this desire to look, mixed with icy terror, BARZOG recognized something akin, as if this void was part of himself, long asleep and finally awakened. And so, after weeks of tormenting struggle, when the hum had turned into an insistent, exhausting pain spasm in his temples, BARZOG made his decision. He chose 50 of the hardiest and most unquestioningly loyal warriors, not young, hot-blooded youths thirsting for glory, but seasoned, silent fighters whose eyes shone not with blind fury but cold, battle-tested resolve, whose faces were like weathered stones, and whose hands knew both the heft of an axe and the weakness of an enemy's neck under a blade. When the band formed up at the camp's southern exit, the shaman, his face distorted with anxiety and fear, decisively blocked the chieftain's path, spreading his bony arms on which dry skin stretched like parchment. BARZOG, his voice, usually dull and monotone, now rang with an unfamiliar, piercing alarm. Do not do this. The spirits whisper to me of danger, of a shadow falling on your path. That which calls you it is not of this world. It is alien to the stones beneath our feet and the air we breathe. To heed this call is to turn your back on the ancestors, on the very law of our life. BARZOG slowly, with a heavy grating sound, turned to face the elder. His own face was like a mask carved from granite, but deep in the yellow, narrow eyes a real storm raged of fury, confusion, and that very unquenchable craving consuming him from within like a worm. He looked at the shaman, at his trembling fingers, at the faded amulets of bone and feathers. And suddenly, it all seemed pitiful and insignificant to him. A cheap trick, a child's game at secret forces beside that resonant, eternal tide now calling him without words, by mere inexorable heaviness in his blood. The spirits of my ancestors are silent about this, he growled, and each sound came with effort through clenched teeth, as if words were heavy stones he had to roll out from the depths of his chest. But this voice, it speaks to me, and I will listen. I must listen. There was no arrogance in his words, only a simple, terrible statement of fact, cold and final as a verdict. The shaman froze as if struck in the solar plexus, then his body shuddered, and in his dry, sunken eyes flared a despair bright and wild as flame in dry grass. It is not a voice, but a sickness, a delusion, a glamour sent by enemies. The shaman in desperation seized the chieftain's sleeve with his trembling, bony fingers, and their grip was surprisingly strong, tenacious as the roots of an old tree biting into rock. His voice broke into a shrill, hoarse whisper full of ancient, superstitious terror. It will lead you away from your people. It will lead you from your fate. You are needed here, BARZOG. Your place is here, with us. by this fire. For a moment, the chieftain wavered. He saw genuine, animal fear in the elder's eyes, that primeval horror born in the soul at the sight of encroaching darkness that cannot be understood or explained. He heard sincere, hard-won conviction in his trembling voice, that very faith that had held their kin in this pitiless steppe for ages. Before him was not just an old man, he was the keeper, the last bastion of the old world, and his despair was the despair of this very land, feeling its son depart. All this pierced Barzog for an instant with a sharp shadow of doubt, making him feel the weight of his choice not only on his shoulders, but somewhere deeper. In that place where memory of the first fire, the first battle cry, the warmth of the common circle in the cold, lay hidden. But then the hum in his consciousness flared with new, unprecedented force, piercing and imperious, blotting out everything: the shaman's pleading words, the hushed, watchful nose of the camp behind, reality itself, which suddenly seemed fragile, unreal, like poorly cured hide ready to tear from one sharp movement. This inner roar was denser than stone, older than any spirits, more real than his own heartbeat. It filled everything, leaving no room for anything else, turning the elder's fear into a pitiful whisper, the rustle of dry leaves under a giant's feet. He roughly, almost flinging, freed his arm from the elder's tenacious grip. The movement was sharp, full of contemptuous strength. The bony fingers of the shaman opened with a quiet click of joints, and the old man staggered as if bereft of support. His arm hung in the air, helpless and empty. "My place is where my will leads me." Barzog cut him off, and in his voice, low and rasping, there remained not a trace of doubt, only steel resolve polished to a shine. "And my will leads me south." He said no more. Words were exhausted, like water in a dried-up riverbed, and, without looking back at the shaman's blanched, horror-distorted face where pain, betrayal, and soul-chilling prophetic fear mingled, with a sharp, honed gesture he led his band away from the camp toward that cult that had become part of himself, denser than blood and stronger than bone. He left behind not just an encampment, he left bewildered, frightened tribesmen whose faces were masks of confusion. He left smoldering fires, the smell of smoke and roasted meat, the clang of familiar weapons. He left the superstitious, soul-chilling terror in the eyes of the elder, who remained standing at the entrance, small, stooped, and infinitely alone against the backdrop of the world he knew, a world that had just cracked. He walked, not knowing what he would find in that distance beckoning him, in that trembling ashen haze at the horizon's edge where sky merged with earth. But he could no longer resist, nor did he wish to, that pull which proved stronger than duty, stronger than reason, stronger than the very steppe that had borne and nurtured him. The steppe remained behind, vast, cruel, mother and grave, and ahead lay only silence, full of a voiceless call, and his own will, hard and lonely as a blade drawn for a final, unknown strike. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.